Welcome. This is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart because in the early 90s, there was a revolution in mental health and substance abuse treatment. And what happened is we started to discover that most of our substance abuse and mental clients had a history of trauma, and that we had to pick up the mental health and substance abuse symptoms and look at what was under those symptoms. And that to treat these clients, we had to understand the neurobiology of trauma. And we discovered that trauma has such profound impacts on the brain, self-regulation, people's feelings about themselves, and on the body, that to do that, we need to understand the impacts of trauma. Not only that, but we need to teach the clients how to understand the impacts of trauma. And because clients with trauma are constantly in a state of threat, we need to design treatment that creates a climate of safety. We also need to be able to put ourselves in the client's shoes and understand that all that annoying, dysfunctional behavior like temper tantrums is really the client's attempt to deal with their trauma symptoms. In other words, symptoms are an adaptation to trauma. And here's some of the data. They did a study and looked at general adults and found that 56% of a general adult sample had at least one traumatic event. But in mental health settings with severe mental illness, over 90% had trauma history, and most have multiple experiences of trauma. Not only that, but if you have a serious mental illness, you tend to put yourself in situations where you get traumatized more. 93% of adolescents in inpatient settings reported a history of trauma, and 92% of incarcerated girls reported sexual, physical, or severe emotional abuse. We especially look at the impact of trauma on substance abuse. Over 70%, and I'm guessing probably closer to 90%, of substance abuse clients have a significant trauma history. And as we understand the neurobiology of trauma and the biological effects of trauma, we now know that substance abuse is often a way to medicate trauma symptoms. In other words, if you feel numbed out, dead inside, what do? Take meth. If you feel anxious all the time because of the trauma, what do? Use heroin or drink. So clients have used their substance abuse as a way to survive trauma. And we have 4 goals in this webinar. One is to understand the signs and symptoms of trauma and how behaviors are developed as a way to cope with trauma. I'm also going to give you a very, very short review of how trauma impacts the brain. And then we're going to talk about what exactly do you have to do in treatment to take trauma into account in our treatment. And the last thing is, how do you avoid re-traumatizing clients in treatment who are already traumatized? When we ask what's trauma, SAMHSA defines it as an event or series of events that's experienced as physically or emotionally harmful and that has lasting adverse effects on mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. And we make a distinction between big T trauma, which qualifies for a PTSD diagnosis because you're risking death or physical harm, and little t trauma, like I lost my job, I lost my house, my husband is divorcing me. But trauma has a profound impact. In the new DSM-5, there are 4 main symptom categories for trauma. And you will see these all the time in your clients, but they don't make the connection either that they're experiencing these feelings because of trauma. The first one is re-experiencing. We have a number of clients in our facility who wake up screaming in the middle of the night because they're having nightmares. So disturbing memories, dreams, flashbacks. We have clients who hide in the closet when they get triggered. Or intense psychological or physiological distress. That's what we talk about as trauma triggers. Somebody says something that reminds the client of their trauma, and they end up hiding under the bed or throwing a fit. Another category of symptoms is avoidance or numbing. So clients will avoid thinking about, talking about, being any places that remind them of the trauma. And often they just feel shut down. So we have a lot of clients who are numbed out. Sometimes they may not even remember all the details of the trauma. The other thing is that clients who have a trauma history have a highly sensitized threat arousal symptom. They tend to be irritable, have angry outbursts, they can't concentrate very well, they have startled responses, and most of them have sleep difficulty. And the last category, and this was just added in DSM-5, is clients with a trauma history tend to have a lot of negative beliefs about themselves and the world. I was working on that in a group this morning, and I had one client who had 2 pages of negative beliefs. Since she was sexually abused at age 5, she believed that anybody who knew that that had happened to her would totally reject her, and that she was dirty and completely worthless. And of course, she's extremely depressed. But what we've also discovered is that it's not as simple as PTSD. If clients have traumatic experiences that are interpersonal, in other words, their mother pimps them out to her boyfriends, or intentional, or prolonged and repeated, the trauma has an even more profound impact. And so we have re-experiencing, avoidance, numbing, and arousal, plus clients with complex trauma have a lot of emotional difficulties. They don't have the ability to self-soothe. They're chronically anxious. They have hair-triggered tempers, low frustration tolerance, suicidality. They're always monitoring for threat. The other thing we see with complex trauma is that because trauma and sympathetic arousal shut down the cerebral cortex, it simply goes offline. They don't think very well. They have poor problem solving. They're not good at anticipating consequences. They can't figure out how to get themselves out of trouble. And they have a lot of social difficulties. So picture that you've grown up in a household where you were being sexually abused and physically abused. You tend to have poor boundaries, to seek attention in inappropriate ways, have problems with authority figures, all of the things that we see in our clients and go, how come? Well, how come is because of a history of trauma. And we know that when somebody has been traumatized, their brain changes. So that for one thing, they're in a constant fear and threat mode. They're always at hair trigger or shut down. They're in defense mode. They tend to expect the worst. They don't learn very well, which is why sometimes cognitive therapy isn't enough. They tend to have a short fuse and a hyper-aroused body. And I'm just going to talk about the brain changes for a minute. We have a little almond-shaped brain, part of the brain that's called the amygdala. It's down in the midbrain, the limbic system. And it's the alarm system of our brain. And what happens in people who are traumatized is the amygdala actually gets more sensitive. In other words, it grows extra neurons. So it's like you have a burglar alarm that's set so that a kitty cat walking across the living room will freak you out and will set off the alarm. We also know you've got a whole body and brain is hypersensitive to anything that smacks of threat. And that's what we have to keep in mind. We also have to keep in mind that the sympathetic nervous system in somebody with a trauma history is highly dominant. We call it hot system. They're living in their hot system, so they're very reactive. The study that happened in the 1990s that turned everything on its head is a study done by Kaiser Permanente. And what they did is they developed a questionnaire that asked whether you had any of these 10 experiences: psychological abuse by parents, physical abuse, sexual abuse, physical neglect, emotional neglect, substance abuse, mental illness in the family, separation and divorce, domestic violence, or an imprisoned family member. So they sent this questionnaire to 17,000 enrollees in their health plan. Now, these are not your typical street people. These are people who are employed for the most part, a lot of them college educated. And what they found blew them out of the water, because they found that only 32% of their population had none. 26% had one, 16% had two, and another 10% had three, but 16% had four or more. Now let me tell you about the clients we get in Chandler. When we look at ACE scores, we have something like 70% who have four or more. And a lot of times we have clients who have 6 or 7 or more ACE events. What they did is they correlated the ACE scores with everything: chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, diabetes, obesity, heart problems. In other words, every chronic medical problem and every mental health problem. I'm just going to show you a few of the graphs. When they correlated it with history of depression, 4 or more ACE events, your risk of being depressed is up to 60% versus 15% if you have none. ACE score and suicide attempts. So why do we get people who've been hospitalized repeatedly for suicide? Because they have an incredibly complex trauma history. ACE score in teen sexual behavior, ACE score in adult alcoholism, ACE score in substance abuse. If you are have an ACE score of more than 4, your risk of being addicted to drugs is 1,500% higher than somebody with none. So that we have to have this in the back of our mind all the time, because no matter, clients who have a history of trauma can be as annoying as possible, and they do stupid, dysfunctional stuff, but they learned a lot of that as a way to survive an overwhelming, ongoing sense of threat. And so one thing about that is that we have to be constantly sensitive to the fact that our clients have a threat alarm that is set to ultra sensitive. We only have to look at them cross-eyed and they're going to throw a fit. So clients with trauma history have a lot of triggers, and triggers are anything that reminds clients of the original trauma. Smells, sights, sounds, sensations can all trigger intense fear, anger, withdrawal, emotional shutdown, desires to use. And let me just throw in one comment. When clients become sober, when they get to our program, if they've been using substances as a way to treat trauma symptoms, they are going to get flooded by trauma symptoms. And that can really sabotage early recovery if we're not aware of it. When triggered, clients do act in maladaptive and frustrating ways, and their thinking brain isn't working very well. So I call it the limbic storm when I'm talking to clients. They get triggered into their limbic storm, and they've done everything they can to figure out how to shut that down so they can survive. So when we're talking about trauma-informed care, there are a number of aspects of it. One is that we are going to promote an awareness in ourselves and in the clients of the impact of trauma. And I got to tell you, if you don't ask clients about their trauma history, they won't tell you. And a lot of times they don't make the connection between what they're feeling now and the trauma history. So part of what we have to do is teach clients about trauma and that how they're feeling and the behaviors they're using are understandable in the context of what they've been through. So the question is not what's wrong with you, it's what happened to you. And we recognize in trauma-informed care that trauma symptoms and behaviors are adaptive. That means we look at them as resilience rather than pathology. We have a lot of clients who if they hadn't developed the maladaptive behaviors they had, might be dead instead of in our care. And we also, one of the things we've discovered, and a woman named Sandra Bloom has written a lot about this, is something called sanctuary trauma, which is mental health and substance abuse treatment programs can do things that actually re-traumatize traumatized clients. For example, SAMHSA has now taken a position that every program that receives any federal money has to have trauma-informed care. And that means they train all their staff in trauma-informed care, and that they also quit practices that are re-traumatizing. For example, restraining clients. Imagine a client who has a history of being held down while they were being raped by their father. And we then restrain them. What's going to happen? They're going to be overwhelmed, terrified. And some of the other practices that we used to use in mental health treatment, like not telling people what their treatment plan was, us deciding what they needed, and not collaborating with the client, some other more coercive treatment methods, when you're doing them to a traumatized client, are incredibly re-traumatizing and tend to make it much more difficult for them to actually recover. So one aspect of trauma-informed care is we do everything that we can to create a sense of safety, that we examine all of our practices and say, would this make a client feel safe here? One of the things we do here in Chandler is we work very hard on helping the clients create a supportive environment among the clients. And what our clients say to us is, this is the first time that I've felt like I'm surrounded by people where I'm safe. and the clients support each other. So we have a client who comes into the program and they're highly activated, they're terrified. They've been to 6, 8, 10 rehabs before, and the other clients reach out to them to help them feel safe. They'll say, yeah, I know you're scared now. I felt terrible the first 2 weeks in treatment, and it gets better. And they talk about their experience. The other thing is that we have to work toward trauma recovery, and I want to talk for a second about the old AA philosophy, which is you never deal with trauma before somebody's been in recovery for 6 months or a year. Well, that would be well and good if the person didn't have a trauma history. But we have a lot of clients who will never stay in recovery unless we address the trauma. And we do a lot of work with EMDR to help clients with severe trauma histories to reduce their arousal around those traumas so that they're not having constant flashbacks and panic attacks, because when they have those symptoms, their immediate thought is, let me take something to make it go away. For example, we had a client with one of the most severe sexual abuse histories I've ever heard. She started using heroin when she was 11 because that helped her to survive the ongoing sexual abuse. And when she came to us, she was awake every night and screaming nightmares. She would get anxiety and panic attacks where she would huddle in a corner with her hands over her head. Was she going to be able to let go of heroin unless we dealt with some of that? I don't think so. And it's not that we do trauma first. We do trauma and substance abuse treatment. We do trauma and mental health treatment because we understand that the trauma drives a lot of the other symptoms. The other thing about trauma-informed care is that we support control, choice, and autonomy. And Sovereign, for example, asked the clients sit down and sign their treatment plan. That's part of trauma-informed care. We give them some control over the treatment plan, and it's part of what creates safety. We explain the rules. We help clients to understand why we do the things we do in treatment. So I want to talk a little bit about how we create a safe, welcoming environment for clients. One is we do a good job of orienting them to the program. And we've realized here in Chandler that we don't do that well enough. And we're going to start implementing some changes to help clients understand, for example, what are typical feelings that you're going to have in early recovery. And we're going to teach them grounding and stabilization exercises in their first week in our environment. So we're really looking at what can we do to make our program feel safer and more welcoming when clients first come here. There's another piece of it, though, which is we have to be willing to look at ourselves, because if we aren't emotionally self-regulated, in other words, a client gets squirrely and starts yelling or getting angry or coming down in the middle of the night and wandering around the living room, which is against the rules. If we confront it, we don't do it with our own emotions dysregulated. So yelling at clients, reacting to their reactions, end up feeding that sense of lack of safety. And it becomes kind of an evil circle, which is we end up triggering the client triggers us. We react in a way that triggers the client, so they get much worse, then we get more triggered. So what we have to be able to do is model calm self-regulation. So we have to be able to self-soothe in order to provide a safe environment. We need to use assertive rather than aggressive body language and tone. So saying to a client, I can't believe you're reacting this way. What is the matter with you? Is going to end up triggering the client rather than helping them to calm down. So we might say, you know, we have a rule about this, but we do it in a gentle, assertive, rather than aggressive tone of voice. We also need to remind clients of the need to be respectful to each other. So we do a lot of work with ground rules. We do a lot of work in talking about how you need to support each other, because you can't heal if you don't feel safe. So we're really examining our own treatment program and looking at ways we might be able to create a safer, more welcoming environment for clients, because all of our clients have a trauma history. That's kind of our niche within Sovereign. So we need to change some of how we introduce clients to the program, and we're really looking at that right now. Another thing that's really important is to be consistently compassionate and non-judgmental, because when we look at clients with a severe trauma history, they don't have a history of supportive, compassionate relationships with others very often. They've been treated badly. They've been put down. They've been shamed. I'm always amazed by the terrible things that parents sometimes say to their kids, like, if you wouldn't have been born, my life would be fine. Well, a client that comes in with that history, if they sense that we're judgmental, they're going to shut down or get reactive. There's also, we have to have an underlying deep down belief that the client is doing the best she or he can. In other words, that the negative behaviors are a coping strategy, or were a coping strategy that worked for a while. They may not be working very well anymore, and the client needs to change them, but we have to help them see what the behaviors are costing without shaming them for the behaviors that they have, because they help them survive. We also have to validate the client's experience. So one of the things is helping them to see that feeling frantic and panicked and scared and having nightmares and having flashbacks is not a defect, that it's a response to terrible things that happen to them, and that they have reasons for feeling and acting the way they do. We also have to hold out hope. A lot of our clients come to us really hopeless. Again, I don't know if that's true of all the Sovereign facilities, but at least the clients we get, many of them have been through rehab, hospitalization, and we have to hold out the hope that there is healing, that you aren't going to feel this way forever. I had a client the other day who is coping with some of her memories of early abuse, and she feels terrible. And one of the things I said to her is, yeah, it makes sense, because you're in the middle of a root canal. But the thing to remember is that we're going to help you get through this so that you don't have to feel this way forever. And it is so wonderful when we do closing ceremonies and clients talk about I feel such a sense of hope. I feel like I found myself. I feel like I've got my smile back or my laugh back. To see people come in as broken, as many of our clients, and leave with a sense of hope is one of the most gratifying experiences I have ever had. That also means that when clients are activated, all of our staff, house managers, drivers, need to be able to listen empathetically. Doesn't mean we're doing therapy, but if a client wakes up, especially house managers, if clients wake up in the middle of the night because they're having nightmares, they need somebody who can say, take a breath, can help them to calm down. They may get out a coloring book or give them a blanket to wrap themselves in. We give every client who comes in here a little squishy caterpillar that they can hold that is kind of a sensory grounding object. But they talk about, my house manager's wonderful. When I'm upset, she'll often talk me off the ledge. And so the house managers actually see the clients more than the therapists do. So the house managers have to be really good at responding empathetically to clients who are traumatized. We also have to really educate clients, which is, we do a lot of psychoeducation on understanding the impact of trauma, understanding why they feel the way they do, identifying negative beliefs that are associated with trauma. I tell clients, you've got to become a trauma trigger detective, which is to start to notice what activities trigger you and then figure out strategies for self-soothing. Most of you are probably familiar with the SUD scale, Subjective Units of Distress scale. And it goes from 0, it doesn't bother me at all, to 10, it's the worst I can imagine feeling. And what we teach clients is if your SUDS is over a 4 or 3 or 4, then you need to have some strategies you can use to self-soothe. So we have coloring books. We have other activities that clients can do that will help them to calm down when their SUDS level goes up. We also try to be really good about explaining procedures and policies, because if we're transparent and open, it contributes to that sense of safety that clients need so desperately. We also teach clients a lot of grounding and stabilization skills. We teach them deep breathing. Inhale to the count of 4, exhale to the count of 4. Imagine that as you're exhaling tension, and as you're inhaling a sense of calm. So we teach all kinds of breathing methods. We also teach clients something called 3-2-1, which is a physical grounding exercise, which is, I'd like you to name 3 things that you see in this room. I'd like you to describe 3 sounds that you hear. I'd like you to identify 3 physical sensations. Now I'd like you to find 2 things that you see, 2 physical sensations, 2 sounds, and then 1. What that tends to do is if a client is at a 3, 4, 5 hyperarousal, that can bring it down real quick because they're moving from paying attention to that internal arousal and emotional reactivity. This morning in a group I was teaching clients how to create a container that would hold their feelings when they're overwhelmed. So they can only have the ones that they're ready to deal with right now. So we teach them to put away some of the overwhelming emotions so that they can come back to them later when they have the resources. We help clients find self-soothing, coloring, exercise, meditation. We have clients generate a list of maybe 25 things, and I frequently ask clients, what self-soothing exercises have you used this week? We help clients find a safe place. And so we have them visualize a safe place, a place where they feel calm and peaceful, and we ask them to really create that picture. We may even ask them to draw the safe place and to learn to go there when they feel overwhelmed. We teach clients a number of other self-soothing strategies. One I use is a butterfly hug, and clients cross their arms in front of them and just alternately tap on their shoulders. It's bilateral stimulation, but it can be very soothing. We also will ask them to just tap their feet alternately for about 6 or 7 times. That sometimes helps the arousal level to go down. But we do, one of our goals is for every client to have a repertoire of grounding and self-soothing skills so that when they do get freaked out, they know how to calm down. So we're constantly teaching skills, teaching skills, teaching skills. And one of the things that a lot of our clients say is, I've been in a lot of other rehabs that talked about sobriety, but they didn't teach me the skills I needed to deal with cravings or to deal with panic. So we have to do a lot of education when we have traumatized clients and help them find a way to calm themselves down, especially, again, if we've got people with a history of complex childhood trauma, because if you don't have good, if you don't have nurturing parents somewhere in your history or nurturing somebody, you may have never learned how to self-regulate and how to calm yourself down. So clients need a lot of skills. In conclusion, what I'm really saying is that regardless of your role at Sovereign or any other facility, every single person who has a contact with clients for any reason has to practice trauma-informed care, which is to look at how can we create an environment where someone under a constant state of threat is able to let the walls down because they feel safe. So we've got to create the healing climate, and it's on every one of us to look at the ways we can do that. And I challenge every facility to look at how our policies and procedures and ways of operating with clients can create an environment in which somebody with a severe trauma history can feel safe enough to heal. So thank you very much for your participation in this seminar, and I will turn it back over for questions and answers. Do we have some questions that have come in?
Yes, Dr. Drury. All right. Thank you, Dr. Drury. We are now going to start our question answer round. This is for all the attendees. You can still submit your questions through the question pane of your attendees control panel. Okay, we have some questions here.
Go ahead.
Okay, this is a question from Jay. You want to ask, can you define traumatic events, please?
Yes. Again, I talked about big T traumas and little t traumas. Big T traumas, according to the DSM-5, are traumatic events in which people feel like there's a physical threat to their safety. But there are lots of events that can be traumatic because they end up making people feel overwhelmed and helpless. In other words, they're they're events that are beyond our current resources to address. So big T events would be like a life-threatening illness, an auto accident, a natural disaster, a mugging, a rape. Little T events might be things like losing your job, being abandoned. With kids, there are lots more things that are traumatic, like your parents being domestically violent with each other is a big T trauma for a little kid. Other questions?
The next question is from Joel. What would you suggest for self-care for clinicians, specifically for those who are in addiction recovery and are susceptible to vicarious traumatization?
Would you add, I missed the first part of the question, ask it again. As I understood it, she was asking what strategies would help people who are in recovery. Again, helping people to recognize when they're triggered and then giving them a repertoire of strategies for using to reduce arousal level is going to help them to get on top of some of the things that would often trigger relapse. Because if you're trauma triggered and you're in recovery, you get exposed to something that's a trauma trigger, you're much more likely to relapse unless you have a repertoire. So all of the grounding and self-soothing tools are really important. There's an excellent book by Anna Baranowski and Eric Gentry, and it's called, I forget the name of it, but it has a whole lot of self-soothing and stabilization skills. There's also an excellent article by Eric Gentry on gifts from within called Traumadiction that has a whole list of self-soothing strategies and describes how people in addiction can use those to deal with coping.
Okay, we have got the next question from Malene. Do you have a specific population you work mostly with, or are the techniques presented for use with child up to adults?
They work for child to adult, but you're going to do different things. I work with an EMDR therapist who works with kids as young as 18 months, and she does all kinds of stabilization exercises along with doing EMDR. Her name is Robbie Tapia, and she's written a couple of books on doing EMDR with children. But yes, I think here I'm basically always been an adult therapist, so usually 18 and above. But I think these are applicable all the way up and down the spectrum. We just change our way of describing them to clients.
Okay, moving on to the next question. Amber want to ask, how long do you often have clients in your program for?
We are a 30, 60 to 90-day program, and so we have some clients with really severe trauma history who've been here for about 90 days. We have clients who may only be here 30 days. Most of our clients are here for 30 days. So we have some time to do trauma work as well as teaching them DBT, yoga, and all kinds of other skills.
All right. Now, Dana want to ask, how would you measure recovery from trauma?
Well, there are some instruments that you can use that measure PTSD. One of them is called the PCL. It's on the Center for PTSD website, and it will measure how many PTSD symptoms somebody has. So you can measure at the beginning of treatment and then at the end of treatment. You can also use some of the mini assessments in the DSM-5 to look at reductions in symptoms like depression and anxiety. So there are a number of ways you can look at treatment outcomes. What we see is when clients say, I no longer have nightmares, I'm not having flashbacks, I don't get upset every time I think about the trauma, I'm feeling less cravings, I'm not getting triggered as often. Those are some of the things we're going to see when somebody is recovering from trauma.
Okay. The next question is from Amber. Have you found success with the feeling state addiction protocol in your EMDR work?
Yes, we don't always use that protocol, but we do use it, and yes, it is effective. We often have clients who come in with very specific traumas, like I was abused by my stepfather, and we will often work on the specific abuse memories first, and then before the client is released, we will do something called the feeling state protocol or future template to have them look at how they can maintain their recovery.
Right. The next question is from Sharon. She wanna ask, how would you deal with adolescents who has had multiple trauma through their life and have shut down emotionally?
Um, Sometimes what we have to do is help the person. We talk about hyperarousal and hypoarousal. Hyperarousal is they're always anxious and agitated. Hypoarousal is they don't feel anything. And actually the data shows body interventions are particularly useful. So we may ask clients, what are you noticing in your body when you talk about this experience? And we'll watch for things like, does the client shrink, and get them to open their posture so that they can be more in touch with what they're feeling. So we have techniques and strategies that we can use to help people wake up. Yoga helps, so does physical exercise. Body interventions really help with the hypo-aroused client. Next
All right.
question.
Yeah, Dr. Drury, we are receiving lots of comments and compliments from the audience. Deborah saying that it's very informative and very wonderful presentation. You obviously are an expert. Do you have a book?
I don't. I thought about writing one. I haven't. I don't know if you've got a way you could post that for people, but I could put together a bibliography of some really good books on trauma if there's some place we could post them, or if I send them to you, we could send them to people. It might be next week before I could do it, but I can give you a lot of books to look at that really address all of these issues. Another thing I would suggest that people do is Google Janina Fisher, Janina Fisher. She has a lot of articles on this stuff. The other book I would highly recommend is Bezel van der Kolk's book called The Body Keeps the Score, which is a history of his growing knowledge about trauma.
So, Dr. Drury, we have a very enthusiastic audience here. We are still receiving lots of questions. So, keeping the time frame in mind, we have to end this session here. We'll reach out to each and every individual. I'll send your questions to Dr. Drury and we'll address all your questions after the webinar.
And I will send you a bibliography beginning of next week that we could send out to people who have questions.
All right, sure. Okay, so thank you, Dr. Drury, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. If you have any other questions, please send in your queries at ceu@sovhealth.com or webinar@sovhealth.com. Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a thank you email within 24 to 48 hours with the link to event feedback form. And we would really appreciate if you fill that and complete the form and provide your valuable feedback. In this email, you will also receive a recording of today's webinar and the webinar PPT as well. Now, I'll explain how you can earn your CE certificate. You will need to register yourself on solveinstitute.com. I repeat, solveinstitute.com, and complete the short questionnaire and feedback form in order to generate your CE certificate. Please save your login credentials for future use so that you can access several other existing CEU presentations, answer the question that follows, and earn CE for those presentations as well. You can also view our upcoming free CEU events in future on solvinstitute.com. This presentation will be available to watch after 72 hours. You will receive an email with all the information pertaining to this webinar and how you can earn your CE certificate. Thank you everyone. Thank you for your participation. We hope you found this information valuable. We'll be coming up with more interesting webinars next month as well. So keep joining us. Thank you and goodbye.